Life is not meant to be a pursuit of a singular purpose. There's so many different interests that we have, and we should not anchor ourselves to one singular interest. It's not a healthy thing to do.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to 80% Mental, a podcast all about the psychology of sport and performance and health and well-being. And this week we've got a really exciting episode with a fantastic guest, and we're going to dive into mental health and how we might realize our potential. And I'm going to introduce our guest in a minute. But as usual, we've got Leah Washington here, Dr. Leah Washington. How are you doing today?
I'm doing all right. How are you?
I'm good. What banter have you got for me today? I know you love banter.
Banter have I got for you? I've been, it's right around the Olympics, so that's pretty much my whole personality right now.
What have you been enjoying at the Olympics so far?
Oh my gosh, I've been watching so much track and field, water polo. I've been watching... What else did I really get into? Obviously, the gymnastics of it all.
Obviously.
Swimming.
So just everything?
Yeah, pretty much all of it.
Okay.
Pretty much all of it. I watched a bunch of equestrian this year, so that was really exciting. And I have waiting for me some wrestling and some sport climbing.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I think this episode's probably going to come out after our Olympic review episode. Right. So we will have already talked about the Olympics quite heavily by the time we get to this one. But as I say, today's episode is all about mental health and well-being and living up to our potential. And we've got the perfect guest for today. And I'm really, really happy to welcome Rob Schinke to the podcast. Sports psychologists among listeners will know who Rob Schinke is, but I'll give him an introduction anyway. Rob is a two-term president of the International Society of Sport Psychology, the ISSP. He's past president of the Association of Applied Sport Psychology and editor-in-chief for the International Journal of Sport and Exercise Psychology, so heavily involved in sport psychology. He's worked extensively with Olympic and professional athletes as well. From the international sport community, and is known for his research on elite athletes' transitions and identities. Rob, it's such a pleasure to have you here. Welcome to the podcast.
I'm so delighted that you invited me. Thank you so much.
Awesome. And I know that you've worked as a practitioner at the Olympics, and as Leah mentioned, at the time of recording now, obviously we're right in the middle of the Olympics or towards the end. What was your favorite Olympic experience, as a practitioner? I know you've been to several.
I think I'll start with the most challenging one, and the most challenging one was the Tokyo Olympics, delayed by 1 year, and working a lot with high performance boxing and trying to get them to spar and do a lot of mental rehearsal around sparring when they had no access and contact, sparring partners, and then going straight from there to the Olympics, where the athletes were sequestered to their homes. And then before too long, we were in a training camp, and that's where they sharpened their sparring skills on a very short turnaround, and then getting some of the athletes into the quarterfinals at the Olympic Games. That was kind of a neat experience for me. The interest in the Olympics, though, for me actually stemmed from some earlier experiences that I had as an athlete. I was on the Canadian equestrian team in 3-day eventing. So I actually qualified by IOC standards for an Olympic Games, which most people don't know. But that was sort of the catalyst, my own inconsistencies and challenges and inability to cope with stress that brought me into this area of mental performance and the possibility of interfacing with a lot of really wonderful coaches and athletes and organizations.
So, Rob, I want to get into the topic that we want to talk about today. And it feels like there's been a significant shift in maybe the last 5 years, maybe the last 10 years, towards much more of a focus on mental health and on well-being in sport. There's several position papers, including some of your own. And I just want to get it in here as well. I've just published a position paper with Joran Kenter and a few other colleagues on mental health and coaching. But what do you feel has driven this shift, and what are the implications of that?
What's funny, till about 10 years ago, there were few discussions on mental health, and yet it's always been in the background, even though we really haven't uh, centralized it in working with athletes. But that shift began in, I think, 2015, 2016, when I was working with the International Society of Sports Psychology. And there were sort of murmurings about the importance of mental health. All the while, my own work was on athlete marginalization and some of the challenges with acclimation, which into communities I was working with Indigenous athletes or refugee athletes or immigrant athletes, and some of the challenges with adaptation, which compromise their mental health. And with all of the globalization of high performance sport and athletes moving from one country to another, and professional athletes moving from Brazil to Europe, and the attrition rates after about 18 months, we had to eventually turn our gaze. It was inevitable that we would turn our gaze to athlete mental health and try to figure out not just some of the challenges surrounding the stresses associated with high performance sport, but really the other side of the coin that few consider, and that's the thriving individual and how to foster thriving through the sport environment, and then taking the lessons we learn and applying them to the rest of our life. But until about 10 years ago, there were just minor discussions about burnout or about transitions from one stage of a career, particularly onwards to retirement. So people were touching little parts, little catalysts, reasons why people were compromised in their mental health, and no one was looking at the broader area and saying, okay, what does this all involve? What is the geography of athlete mental health? And so with the International Society of Sports Psychology and working with some athletes from Europe and Asia and North America, we took on that position stand. I think it was in 2016, 2017, and the European Federation did theirs on short order just after ours, I think within weeks. So we were all working towards a recognition that we really needed to chart the landscape of athlete mental health and figure out really what's involved in order to augment our practice.
Leah, is this something you've noticed as well, this kind of trend towards mental health and sport and well-being?
Yeah, and I think, coming from my side of things in terms of like sports medicine and athletic training, I think in particular there in the past couple of years, we've definitely seen an increase in sort of like expanding what we mean by athlete health. One of the things that I have found to be a real challenge kind of are twofold. Like one is helping my athletic training students understand that this isn't just for athletes in crisis. Like we talk a lot about like, how do you refer for somebody who really, really needs help? And it's like, well, maybe we could like avoid that altogether and like get them ahead of time, and that we can use these interventions like throughout. Like it's not just about referral, and it's about like integrating some of these concepts, throughout like the rehabilitation process or even beforehand, is sort of managing, some of those stress levels so that they don't get injured in the first place. When we talk about stress management, like this is injury prevention is what we're really talking about, right? And how can we manage some of that well-being so that before we get to a place where they are in crisis or they do have like a significant event. And the other thing is like really wrapping our brains around from an administrative level, like what numbers are we talking about? Like we talk about, like mental health issues affect athletes at the same rate, right, as everybody else, which is usually like around 20%, right? And it's like, well, if I have 400 athletes, right?
Yeah.
Like I'm looking at 80 people at any given moment. If I had 80 people with an ankle sprain in an athletics program, I would be reviewing all of our warm-ups. I would be looking at our load measurements. I would be looking at what are we doing that's creating all of these ankle sprains, right? But we don't kind of consider it in the same way with mental health of if I have this number of people at any given time in an athletics program, I should probably be doing something about this, and I said this to an administrator just the other day, and I was like, how many athletes do you have? And I was like, okay, well, 20% of them at any point. And he looked at me he was like, oh my, he was like, it just had never occurred to him to think of it in real numbers before.
Yeah.
And we talk about oh, it's a problem. Oh yeah, we need to deal with it. But no, when you come down to brass tacks, you this is a bigger thing than you think it is.
No, absolutely. And I've done it already in this podcast. We're only 10 minutes in, and I've already used the phrase mental health and well-being. We talk about those things kind of, and we conflate some of those ideas. I want to focus specifically on well-being, and there's lots of different ways that as psychologists we've traditionally conceptualized well-being. I won't go into them, but I would be really quite interested to hear your take and to understand what you believe well-being to be. How can we define it? How can we conceptualize it?
We try to define it, operationalize it in the new position stand that just came out this year. And I can't, to the life of me, reflect the exact definition, but I think well-being is something that we all seek to achieve. It's a pocket in our life where we are thriving emotionally, psychologically, spiritually as well. And I think it's something that is oftentimes overlooked in sport and exercise psychology because we're so busy working on the improvement of mental health and dealing with athletes in crisis. Whereas when and in the recent consensus statement that you mentioned, one of the reflections that one of my colleagues from the United States, William Parham, he's the mental health officer for the NBA, and his reflection was that we are so busy focusing on treatment and on athletes in distress that we're really not looking at their well-being and looking at the athletes who are thriving and how it is that they are thriving, and really deconstructing that element. We're so busy in a reactive approach to service that we're not being proactive in looking at the thriving individual and what that person might look like, how it is within that individual and within their environment that we could augment a state of thriving.
It's interesting because a lot of the clients that I work with, the individual athletes, is that they're struggling with their performance. And as we sit there and we talk in our initial, intake in our meeting, it almost inevitably, like I'll say, like, you seem kind of like you're just not having a good time. Like a lot of times our one of the goals that we end up having is like having fun again and like finding that enjoyment in their sport again. And it's like it never occurred to them that was like a possible goal.
Is that part of this then? Because you mentioned thriving a couple of times there, Rob. Is that part of this? Is kind of having fun and enjoyment?
Yeah, and we've known that since the basics of mental skills training and this emphasis on process over outcome. And yet we look at the Olympic Games and we look at some of these professional athletes and people who are really under the gun and under strain. And what is the difference when we compare an individual who is thriving versus a person who is under duress and under strain? And I think it's the orientation that of process versus outcome plays a little bit. It's not so simplistic as just saying you need a process orientation. You need a healthy environment. You need strong family of origin. There are so many things at play when we're talking about a healthy individual. But when people get to a certain level of performance, which is an area that I really like to look at, which is high performance sport, sometimes they divert away. And I think that Leah is correct. I fully agree with your words, Leah, is they divert away from what was fun and that pursuit, as Terry Orlick used to say, that pursuit of excellence and that curiosity, creativity, flow, all of these things that are wonderful opportunities, growth opportunities for the pursuit of human potential is ever so important. And yet when we start looking at outcomes and results and medals, people can have the most exceptional result and not have the most exceptional performance. And sometimes when we're looking at outcomes, we're doing that comparatively in relation to other people. We're dealing with the expectations of the people around us, which mitigate stress. And we forget what brought us to the sport entirely from the very beginning, which is that our value system is something we have to be closely tied to throughout our career. If you want an athlete with any sort of longevity and growth experience, and you want to really pull out the growth potential that can be pulled out of high performance sport, you have to anchor the athlete into the value for growth and process and curiosity and creativity, and try to allow the outcome to be the consequence of a pursuit of excellence, a pursuit of human improvement, human development, and not a comparative process in relation to someone else or the pursuit of a piece of hardware.
I mean, and I think part of that also is like, we talk a lot about in elite sport, we talk a lot about sacrifice, right? That you have to be willing to give up a lot of things. You can't go out like a normal person, or you can't, go drinking like you're all with all your friends or whatever it is. But I think we often end up conflating sacrifice with misery. And, unless you're like miserable and in the dirt and in the grime and in the grit of all of it, that like, that's the real work. And it's like, well, you can sacrifice a lot of things, and you don't have to be miserable doing it. Like you can have a joy in that, and you can have like you said, with like the values of what we were doing in the first place. And it's like, well, if you're not grinding it out, then you're doing something wrong. And, like there's this like weird, like it has to be horrible for it to mean something in the end. And that's just like, so
and the
not how outcomes happen.
Yeah. And the Nike commercial that's just come out for the Olympics that just happening now has been kind of heavily criticized, hasn't it? I don't know if you guys have seen it, but it's
winning isn't for everyone.
Yeah, and it's all about how you have to, screw everybody over and be totally single-minded and completely focused and all of this stuff, and not allowed to have any fun. It's just about the work, and it's been really heavily criticized. And I think that kind of suggests that we are kind of changing focus a little bit, and we are thinking more about athlete well-being. And what's been really brilliant to see at this, at the Paris Olympics this year, I don't know if you've noticed it, but it just seems like athletes are just having more fun. They just seem like they're enjoying themselves, not across the board, obviously, but they seem like, fun and enjoyment and just loving what they're doing really seems to be coming through in a way that I don't really think it has before.
And I think this concept of sacrifice, that's quite a narrative, and it's a value-laden narrative at that. Anyone who is seeking to be excellent at something, that's a passion and a driver in their life, and it's something that provides meaning in their life. And how could that be demeaned, devalued as sacrifice? The narratives that people spin in the media, or perhaps even coaches, parents support, in trying to frame a pursuit or resilience as sacrifice, when really it is its resilience and a pursuit of a passion that is equivalent to something you would find in the corporate sector or the academic research sector, the teaching sector. Any area of high performance is nowhere else is that spoken of as sacrifice. It's spoken of as excellence, curiosity, creativity, growth potential, all of these things. And there's also no such thing as the concept balance. There's blends in our life of various competing interests that we would really like to pursue to add meaning to our lives. And for the athlete at this stage in their life, it happens to be sport. And it is not at all a sacrifice to those people. It's a passion.
Rob, just before we get into talking about a little bit about your book, which is it's a fascinating read, I wonder if now's a good point to talk about maybe how cultural sports psychology fits in here, because Leah and I have talked about this before. When we talk about well-being, we do so from a very Western, like Anglo-centric point of view, whereas actually there are lots of different other ways of thinking about what well-being actually means, again from different cultural perspectives. You talked about excellence there and kind of individuation, but actually in lots of cultures that are more collectivist in nature, success and achievement might be defined in very different ways. I don't really know what my question is. I just wonder whether you have any thoughts on that, or whether you can kind of pull some of that apart a little bit for us.
Yeah, I could give you some key highlights along the way, but let me just start with this. I was in high performance sport as a 3-day eventer. Equestrian is a relatively privileged, homogenized environment. It's usually a power that's held by Germany, the United States, Great Britain, countries that are, and people with means within those countries where there's quite a bit of privilege. When I retired, I wanted to get as far away from 3-day eventing and equestrian as I could, though I love it. And I'm now back working with some wonderful equestrians around the world. But at the time, I was at the Olympics on mission staff with the Canadian Olympic Committee, and I noticed that the boxing team was really diverse. And in 1996, I gave my pitch in terms of sports psychology to the technical director, and he said, well, I don't believe in sports psychology, but I like you. You're a nice guy, and you brought me some coffees. I'll bring you to a training camp, which then spurred 25 years of working with inclusion. And in the first few years of working with a national boxing team, I noticed that there were quite a number of Indigenous athletes. But with the Indigenous athletes, what we were finding was the retention of those athletes into a sports system. There was oftentimes a high dropout rate. So I was sitting at a table with some staff, and there was an Indigenous athlete sitting apart from the rest of the other athletes during a lunchtime period. I said, well, I'm going to go over and speak to this athlete. And I was told not to bother. At the time, it's just an athlete who's passing through the system, and to invest in the athletes who were well established on the team. Regardless, I didn't listen. And after lunch, sat down with the athlete in what became a 3-hour conversation about collectivism, individualism, the sorts of skills that he was using in sports psychology, which were not the generic skills that I was taught at 2 Canadian universities. And no one, quite frankly, was being taught that when one works with an athlete, one works with them in relation to their cultural identity. And so with the Indigenous athletes, they don't use sports psychologists. They use elders, they use medicine men, they use drummers, they use sacred medicines, they anchor themselves in their community for motivation. And to actually, as a Caucasian straight male, speaking to this person, obviously having some privilege. I was a doctoral student at the time, and this person had no formal education beyond a few years of high school and was coming from a remote community. The person really was in culture shock. And we were expecting that person to adapt at the snap of a finger to the sports system that the athlete needed to adapt to in order to seek to pursue excellence. So when we talk about the pursuit of excellence and these sorts of wonderful books over the years, it's not a universal, homogenized pursuit of excellence. People come from communities, and we have to understand them. They have to understand us. It's reciprocal, but we have to understand that sports psychology, its value, how it's taught, what are mental skills, whether someone is self-determined or community influenced. All of these things are variable, dependent on who the person is and their background identity.
So, Rob, when we think about this idea of cultural sports psychology, then what kind of things have you learned? What kind of things might be important to consider?
Well, we came to learn very, very quickly, asking people from Nigeria, practitioners where their superstition was prevalent, or Brazil, where religiosity was prevalent for Catholic professional footballers, and then looking at people from the United Arab Emirates, and starting to deconstruct around the world, Indigenous athletes, Aborigine Indigenous athletes versus Canadian Indigenous athletes, and starting to differentiate the athletes and their wants and their desires and how they actually motivated or self-motivated. It was quite different around the world. And that's without ever considering that within a single country, there's a lot of individuality and a lot of identity. The sports psychology's mandate should be helping the athlete reinforce their identity and finding the right keys, the nuanced keys, in order to help the athlete reach down into excellence so that they could be the best possible version of themselves in this one performance domain, and then take that to the rest of their lives. And so it wasn't being done. Sports psychology was a universal construct. It was cultural in the sense that it was derived from people of privilege and their cultural lens of theories of the self-efficacy, self-concept, self-esteem, self-determination, all of these theories of the self. and we never stop to consider that there are so many nuances in terms of how to augment and reinforce, support people in their pursuits based on meeting them where they are. And that's where cultural sports psychology came into play. And so the onboarding of people into performance environments, high performance environments, necessitates understanding what some of their challenges are with that onboarding so that the onus is not exclusively on the athlete to adapt to the environment. The environment should be sharing in that adaptation process. And over the last 20 years, no matter who the population was that I was speaking with, be it indigenous high performance athletes, Eastern Europeans, refugees, immigrants relocating of their own volition, they all talked about this importance of shared understanding, shared meaning, shared values, shared interests, learning from one another, not just food customs, which is common in Major League Baseball, but really understanding to meet each other where we're at and finding convergences. But we have to understand our differences in order to find our convergences. Some of the biggest issues in professional football and professional sport at large is this issue of we're onboarding athletes, paying a lot of money for those athletes, contractual commitments, and you onboard the athlete physiologically, but you never onboard their potential because you're not onboarding an understanding of who that athlete is. And that's where cultural sports psychology comes to the fore.
And I think it's really interesting. One of the things that I talk a lot with my students about is like, we often view the other athlete, the foreign athlete, the immigrant athlete, as the one with a culture, and that we don't always see ourselves as having a culture, right? Because we are, particularly if we are Western, white, straight, whatever, that we are the norm and everyone else has a culture, right? And that like you yourself come just as much from a culture as anybody else. Thinking about like your culture is just as important to you as other people's culture is to them. And to understand that, like you said, is finding those convergences, but recognizing that it's not, I have one thing and you have this other thing. It's like, you both have a thing and you both have to figure out where you meet. And the other thing that I talk a lot about is like, even if, because you see like, especially in high performance, like you said, with professional athletes, we onboard them, we invest a lot of time and energy and effort and money, that even if you only saw these athletes as commodities, if you only saw them as an asset, you should still give a shit about diversity because you're going to get more out of that asset. You're going to get better performance from that asset if you value them as a human being and if you value the diversity that they bring. So obviously we want people to see them as human beings. We would love for them to have like a whole, like value of a person. But even if you don't, you should still care about this if you want more from these athletes.
Till you care about it, until you're curious about who the athlete is and really understanding them, you're never going to onboard their potential. If we're talking about sports psychology services in relation to high performance sport, particularly professional sport, where there's millions of dollars, millions of pounds on the line in a given contract, you have to at least be curious about what are the keys to that person. And when we talk about onboarding them in the transitional process, the reason I'm curious about transitions is because we don't engage people unless they transition correctly into that new environment. If their fundamental early formative experiences are negative, the challenge of having the person effectively transition is unlikely. And then you have now squandered that human potential, not just in relation to that athlete in your organization, but subsequently as a consequence of those formative experiences in further organizations. And therefore, that person's career is impeded and that person never has the opportunity to achieve their potential.
This is the 80% Mental Podcast. I'm here with Dr. Leah Washington and Professor Rob Schinke, and we're talking all about mental health in sport and well-being in sport. And we've just kind of had a really interesting conversation there around cultural awareness and cultural sports psychology. And and the importance of perhaps kind of expanding our horizons a little bit when it comes to maybe what we're taught in psychology and how to apply that. We've talked a little bit about human potential, and I want to talk a little bit about your book, Gifted, which is a fantastic read. And the book is at the heart of it, it's really all about unlocking potential, right? And recognizing natural gifts. So first of all, Rob, just I kind of want to ask you, what do we mean by natural gifts in this context?
These are the qualities, our ability to apply a technique, a passion that we have where we far exceed the skills and capacities of those around us. So, though I was on the equestrian team, I would say that I'm not entirely convinced I was a gifted equestrian. I think I put in a lot of hours, and I was an elite athlete, sort of on the fringes of high performance sport. But I think when I look at my own background as a researcher, even though I was oftentimes told in my formative experiences that I didn't have the capacities to go on to graduate school and doctoral studies, and was always told that I was just shy of being meeting the threshold of being a researcher or being a systematic person. And yet the way I look at problems and the way the methodologies I use are oftentimes ecological and very innovative. And I think that is a gift, is the ability my ability to see things differently. We all have not just a gift. If we thought we had a single gift, we would have a hard time in our lives. This is why some of the athletes really have a hard time transitioning from their sport identity onward to another identity and another stage in their lives, which could be equally or even more rewarding than the one they're in right now, which then compromises their mental health, right? But back to this concept of gifted, we all have various gifts that in our arsenal that some we might know, we might have learned about early on. Mine, one of them is that I'm a really good endurance athlete. I can run and run and run without getting exhausted. And it was a gift that I knew about in elementary school that was left uncharted and untouched until I came back to it in my 50s and I had a bulge, and I needed to drop some weight. And so I got out and hit the road and was running with my boxers. And then I really discovered that, hey, I could run. And then the coaches kept sending me out with the boxers because I could keep pace with them. And so that was one of my gifts. Curiosity, a second gift, the ability to pull together people and create convergences where other people would create divergences, a gift. We all have those sorts of gifts, artistry, the ability to debate, the ability to see things in a different way than other people might have envisioned, athletic talents, coaching talents, motivational talents, pedagogical talents.
Leah, what are your natural gifts?
Well, not endurance, I can tell you that.
Snark.
I would rather lay down in traffic. I would say I do think one of my gifts is having that curiosity about people, in that I'm always interested of like, why are you the way that you are, right? And trying to, but like,
that sounded really accusatory.
Sometimes, but just sort of an openness to listen. I think I'm really good at that, in that there are a number of times where I've been like, I talk with athletes a lot, obviously. And they're like, and the number of times where I've had conversations where like, I've never told anyone this before, or I've never realized this before. Like, I think that's sort of like my patience and willingness to listen is probably one of my strongest gifts. What about you, Pete?
I mean, it was one of the reasons why I wanted to talk to Rob on the podcast, because I'm not really sure. I think one thing that I'm told is that I communicate well across different mediums. So I think I write reasonably well. I think I can talk reasonably well, present reasonably well. And I think that's kind of why I'm drawn to education, drawn to be an educator. I'm told all of these things. I'm not sure I entirely believe them. But one of my questions, Rob, was how do we discover these natural gifts? Like, I'm 45 now. I'll be 46 in a couple of months. Like, I might be amazing at golf. I've never picked a golf club up in my life. How do people discover what their natural gifts really are. And I guess especially in an environment that is sometimes challenging and maybe not conducive to bringing some of those gifts out.
Yeah, and I think there's two pieces to the puzzle. Let's start off with discovery. And you're right. Discovery happens in environments. So we start off as little kids and free play, and discover we might be a really good footballer. We might be have an artistic inclination, a musical inclination, those sorts of things, and then we decide whether to pursue those opportunities now, to shelve them, maybe to return to them later at another time in life when we have more time. So we have those sorts of opportunities that start very, very early. And you're right, we're oftentimes dissuaded from them by the consequence of an environment. You're quite right. And I've seen that a lot with athletes in professional sport, where they're sort of on the fringes, but people don't really understand, the coaches or the management really, or the scouts really don't understand what they're looking at, because this person's different.
Right.
And if they're different, we don't want those people. We want the people who, it's like a cookie cutter approach to performance. So the environment sort of filters away some of those opportunities for us to excel and apply our gifts in environments. And yet not all is lost, because we have these gifts. Some of them we discover early. Some of them we get these glimpses in our life where, hey, that felt really, really good, and I was really good at that. And I remember that from my childhood. And oftentimes we sort of let it go, and the glimpse fleets across the screen, and it may resurface in 5 or 6 years, or in 6 months, or and it's our subconscious perhaps telling us to really revisit this authentic part of ourselves. And we are all at our most authentic, highly gifted in certain pockets of our lives, right? People talk about authenticity, but authenticity includes the gifts, embracing the gifts that we have and using those in our lives. And the more we use them, the more happiness we're going to experience, and the more meaning in our lives, and the more we could then give to other people around us, and create a much more fertile environment where people could explore the most optimal versions of themselves. We have to be able to curate some of those gifts, if not for now, for the future, so that when we transition to that next stage of our life, we can tap into our potential in another environment. That's really important. The problem is that some educators, many educators that I encountered, I'm sure you could remember educators who you encountered, who really stifle creativity and really want people to sit quiet, belong within the norm, do things in a prescribed way, speak a prescribed way, dress a prescribed way. And if you don't, there's no place for you in that environment. And we all have to battle the naysayers in order to seek out our potential and march on with it, regardless of the environment around us. And there are always going to be naysayers. Why are they naysayers? Because they're not tapping into their own gifts, sadly. And that's the vast majority of people.
I'm laughing when you're saying that, because I was very, very close to doing A-level maths and physics and kind of going down the sort of hard sciences route. And my maths teacher, Mr. Mackay, who won't be listening, but if you are listening, you stopped me from doing maths because you were a dick, and I didn't like you and you didn't like me. So I stopped doing it, and I went down the arts route instead, which worked out fine for me. But I can clearly remember that teacher, like you say, kind of stifling that. And the other reason why I was smiling was, when you were talking there about glimpses, and when I was younger, I was pretty good at guitar and music, and kind of fell by the wayside when I was about 15, 16. And then very, very recently, we inherited a piano. My wife inherited a piano, so we've got a piano in the house now. And I found that I can kind of play the piano in a way that I probably shouldn't be able to play, having never played the piano before. And it's kind of reinvigorated this sort of, I guess, passion for music and understanding music and like hearing music in different ways. And just kind of talking about glimpses that just sort of sparked that off there. So.
And you got to fight for those gifts, because the environment is such that people are not going to give you your props, and people are not going to allow you to explore, and you got to explore anyway. And that's how I've lived my life, with always doing the proverbial finger to people who get in the way of, I just can't help it. It's in my makeup, my DNA to do that. And that's what really this book was about, is overcoming the naysayers and overcoming the inhibitions and pursuing those things in order to have that meaningful life where you're always thriving. And just because one gift is now coming to an end, maybe your athletic career, maybe your coaching career, does not mean, we're just at the tail end of an Olympic Games and there are some athletes who are not going to come back. What will be the place for those athletes? Well, the athletes ideally should have been curating those gifts early enough in the early high performance stage of their career so that they're aware of them and there's part of a plan going forward. And we all have to have that plan, that there's a now time, and there's a time in the future, near future for certain gifts and the far future for other gifts. But the pursuit of is a human imperative and a human condition to thriving, as I say.
Just for anyone who's interested, we recorded a really interesting episode with Dr. Kenza Gunter and Jamila Weidman. It was the back end of series 3 where we talked about athletes transitioning out of sport. And that was one of the themes that came up, talking about having gifts and passions outside of sport, but doing that early rather than waiting until, okay, my career's over. Now what am I going to do? So yeah, really interesting episode if anyone wants to go and listen to that. Leah, have you got any thoughts or comments or even questions about this?
Well, I think the one thing I keep coming back to is Pete, some of your work on coaching, and I think that's the talent of a real genuine coach is someone who can see those untapped gifts, right? Or who can look at something and say that could be a gift, right? Where we kind of going back to this idea of narratives, like a lot of times we'll say oh, that kid is tough to coach, or that kid is a troublemaker, right? Because they're always disrupting the locker room or whatever. And I think it takes some real kind of fortitude as a coach to step back and be like, okay, but this kid, maybe he just has a lot of energy, and what kind of energy could we bring? And how can we use that idea? And I think that the coaches who are the most impactful and the most meaningful to our athletes are the ones who take those gifts and see them as positives and see them as gifts.
Yeah, the kind of Pygmalion effect, right? The self-fulfilling prophecy, and kind of just being really aware of that as coaches and enables them to pull out some of those gifts that maybe people don't see that they've got themselves.
Because I always go back to nothing drives me more insane than when I hear that kid's uncoachable, or that kid's difficult, that kid. And I'm like, okay, well then you got to change what you're fucking doing to meet the kid. It's not the kid's job to change necessarily to meet your style of coaching. If you were a talented coach, you would be able to look at that kid and say, hey, what am I missing? What else can I do for him?
Yeah, but that's a fundamental attribution error at play, right? Where we strictly externalize what we don't understand in another to their disposition of being difficult or complex or a poor fit, as opposed to really thinking, okay, this person is challenging, but we actually need the challenging person in order to go to the next level, because that person needs some fight in them. Yeah. I remember when I landed up moving on from my graduate school to my doctoral studies. And I remember my first semester in my doctoral studies at a new university. And I gathered one of the references that was sent in relation to me was that I had a lot of energy. A negative thing. You look at the energy over the course of the last 20 years, cultural sports psychology, consensus statements, position stands, think tanks, ISSP presidency, ASP presidency, editorships, Canada Research Chair, all of those things, working in Olympic teams on site, going to HBO events. And that energy wasn't such a bad thing. We all have it.
Rob, I just want to sort of change tack a little bit, because one of the other things that I found really interesting in the book was this idea of pushing yourself to your own limits, personal limits, right? So physical, emotional limits. Maybe as a way to catch some of those glimpses of potential you were talking about a little bit earlier on. There's quite a lot of talk in the well-being, wellness space about doing hard things, right? Just do hard things, always do hard things. And I'm just interested to hear a little bit more about that from you.
I'm not sure what you mean by hard things. I think people need to challenge themselves and they need to get out of the comfort zone in order to discover themselves. And never are they more vibrant and excited when they're pushing the boundaries. You
Mm.
can't always push the boundaries. I think there's a time for rest and regrouping and restoration of energy and finding oneself and settling oneself. But I think pushing one's own boundaries and being curious and being persistent and resilient is a really necessary quality in one's life, because otherwise we just fold up our tents and go away. And you have to be able to push those boundaries in yourself and push them in other people in a way where people are good with it.
No, I think I'm really glad to hear you say that, because I think pushing boundaries is absolutely fantastic, and we need to do that. We need to put ourselves out of our comfort zone, like you said. One of the things that's often missing in the well-being space is what you mentioned there, which was the rest and the recovery as
Yeah.
being an important element of that. We can't just push ourselves all the time in order to unlock this potential. So that's kind of what I was getting at.
Yeah, and that's why you have multiple gifts, and not all of them are in a single space. If all that's heralded is the athlete identity, and that's all the person is rewarded for, or they recognize within themselves, they will never make space for other opportunities to recover, restore themselves, build other curiosities, have other lines of pursuit. And that is a recipe for disaster, Peter. I think that we all need to have some time to reflect, time away from the performance environment that we're currently drilling down on and pursuing to the nth degree. And that's where blending interests is really so important, as opposed to chasing down a singular gift, as Kensa probably said in relation to those athletes who are transitioning onward. But that's been a known story for 50 years plus. When you go back to as far back as Terry Orlick's 1980s work with Penny Werther and Dana Sinclair on athletes transitioning out of sport and the ones who keep relapsing back. You see it in the National Hockey League. You see it in Premier Football. You see it in professional boxing. You see it in every freaking sport where people keep coming back because they've got nothing to go to and they're fearful of letting go. And then eventually they are deselected or replaced. And then what? Then what becomes of these people? And they're under the belief that they've got this one singular gift and that one space where they can thrive, which is not. It's the antithesis to your and my belief about giftedness and interests and pursuits. Is a life is not meant to be a pursuit of a singular purpose. You have to have other things to explore, family things, a personal life. You have to be a hobbyist. Hobbies can then turn into pursuits, right? You're curating them. Education. There's so many different interests that we have, and we should not anchor ourselves to one singular interest. It's not a healthy thing to do.
I want to come back to that in a little bit. Leah, go.
Well, I was just going to say, when you were talking about having these outside pursuits, and, we often laud athletes for having like the single-mindedness of their athletic pursuit. And I think a lot about, when you were talking about like with hockey, that they're, with Jacob Trouba and his artistic pursuits and having like, he's a painter now and he's had like gallery shows, but he's seen as such an anomaly and such like an outlier of like, what? Like, but he's portrayed in when people talk about him, right? They talk about how like he's so odd and he's so different. And it's like, no, like that's no, actually.
This is the 80% Mental Podcast. I'm here with Professor Rob Schinke and Dr. Leah Washington. And we're talking about well-being in sport, but we're also talking about this idea of unlocking potential. And we've talked a little bit about Rob's book, Gifted. We'll put a link to the book in the episode description. So if you're interested, and I don't normally do this on the podcast, but I would thoroughly recommend it. So we'll put a link to that in the episode description if you want to go and check out Rob's book. Rob, it's about this time in the podcast that I like to get to know our guests a little bit more. So we've heard about your involvement in different organizations. We've heard about some of your applied work with athletes. But what we don't really get to do on podcasts very much is learn a little bit more about the person. So if you're up for it, I've got a little game to play where we can find out a little bit more about you. Are you happy to play?
I'll play.
Fantastic. I have 4 virtual envelopes, and there's a set of questions in each envelope. So I've got either or, the last time, deep and meaningful, or have you ever? And I'm going to ask you to randomly pick a number between 1 and 4, and I will get the corresponding virtual envelope that has some questions that will allow us to get to know you a bit more.
Okay.
So number between 1 and 4.
3.
3. Okay. What have we got? We have got the last time. So a series of questions about the last time you did something, and we'll get to know you a bit better. And Leah, as usual, feel free to play along. Question 1, Rob. When was the last time you went to the movies?
Last week with my wife and children.
Oh, okay. And the obvious follow-up question, what did you go see?
Deadpool. It was not something that I wanted to see, but it was something my oldest son wanted to see. And to be honest, I fell asleep in a movie, which I'm known to do. It's a huge embarrassment to my oldest son. Is I will start snoring in the middle of a movie if I'm not riveted by it, and that's what happened. It was good. I like Dogpool. I think that was the best part of the movie. It was this funny dog. It's the world's ugliest dog, and the dog had this long tongue. And anyway, I enjoyed that part.
I've not seen that yet. I have fallen asleep in the movies though, only once, and it was when I went to see Eyes Wide Shut.
Oh yeah,
1999 film, I think, with Tom Cruise. One of the most boring films I've ever seen in my life, and I fell asleep after about half an hour. Leah, what was the last time you went to movies?
I went and saw Barbie.
Oh,
I still haven't seen it.
What the fuck?
I know.
Yeah, you need to go see it.
So good. It's such a genius film.
Yeah, you talk about inclusion and exclusion. You got to see Barbie.
Oh my God, it's the best.
It wasn't one I thought I would enjoy, but it was one my wife brought me to, and our kids dragged us along, and I loved it.
Ryan Gosling is a genius in that film.
Oh, he's awesome. Yeah,
he's so good.
Yeah.
Okay, last time you visited a new country?
June, I went to Thailand.
Very nice.
And that was awesome.
Mm.
So I was with I went with the managing counsel for the International Society of Sports Psych, and did that keynote. A number of us had keynotes, and then I was allowed to go along for 3 or 4 days into the hinterland of Thailand, and had an amazing time. I love it there. I love the food. I love the people. So friendly. The weather was stifling. I was dodging. I'm a runner, obviously. So, in one of my runs with a buddy of mine, Christopher Henriksen, we were dodging monkeys in the middle of the road. We went to a town called Monkey Mountain, and I was dodging monkeys. And 7 a.m. it was like 90-something degrees and 90% humidity, and I thought I was going to have a heart attack.
Wow.
Anyway, and one of the monkeys thought he would give chase, and so he was sort of thinking of having a run at us.
I think the last time I went out of the country was to Scotland, actually.
Oh, nice.
Oh, okay.
My partner lived there for a year and went and visited him.
I went to, where did I go to? No, because I've been there before. I was going to say I went to FEPSAC. It was my first FEPSAC conference, and it was in Innsbruck in Austria, but I've been to Austria before, so that doesn't really count. Last time you were given a gift?
Last time I was given a gift, I guess Father's Day. And that was in June. I tend to gift myself an awful lot. I'm a member of a whiskey club, so every second month they ship out a new bottle of whiskey, and I have one coming in the mail within the next week or so.
Yeah.
And I like those very much. But I guess June would have been a gift from someone else versus myself.
Okay, I think giving yourself gifts, that counts, right? That's fine.
Well, yeah, I love being part of that whiskey club. It's my thing.
Last time you overcame a difficult challenge?
Yeah. One of the biggest challenges I had in my life, it became almost a career-ending. It was definitely a life-altering challenge. Was when my university went into insolvency due to misexpenditure by the leadership, and that was in 2020, 2021, and we were getting ready for the Olympics. 30% of the faculty were laid off, and staff, some of my really close friends and running buddies were laid off. And due to the stress of it all, I ended up getting really sick and having this viral arthritis where I couldn't run for 2 years and was on prednisone for quite a while. And it really altered my life for about 3 years. And that was quite something, and just trying to re-engage now.
Yeah. No, thanks for sharing that, Rob. Higher education in the UK is going through some similar stuff in terms of, well, I don't want to say mismanagement, but lots of financial issues.
Yeah, and just because someone's an academic and in administration doesn't mean they have financial acumen, and oftentimes the decisions they make are not necessarily in the best interest of the organization. Might be in their best interest for their CVs, but definitely not necessarily for the institutions that they're meant to serve. And we are all meant to serve.
Well, I mean, I wouldn't say that out loud on a podcast or anything that my employees might be listening to or anything like that. I definitely wouldn't say that. Yeah. No. Last time you cooked a meal for someone, Rob, are you the chef in the family?
No, I used to be the chef, and then we got this wonderful new Wolf oven, and
very fancy.
I was told in no uncertain terms that I would not be using it other than to an omelet for my kids, and I've done that. But I guess I'm third rank because I've got a partner who cooks incredibly well, and a mother-in-law who lives with us, and she cooks incredibly well. So, and now I've got a son who is into cooking. So I've been demoted to grilling steaks and doing Southern barbecue out on the deck. I'm not allowed anywhere near the oven.
There are worse things. Things.
Yeah.
This is a good one. Last time you tried something that you've never done before?
Last time I tried something that I've never done before. That's a good one. I can't even think of anything in that regard. And it's not that I'm conventional or anything, but I've done a lot of traveling. I've eaten a lot of different foods. I don't know.
Yeah, I'm not sure either.
That's a tough one.
I get a lot of I get very nervous about trying new things because I'm a perfectionist and I don't like being bad at things. And so I get a lot of performance anxiety. So it takes a lot for me to try something new. Yeah, I'm trying to think of I might have to get back to you on that one.
You know what, though? There was one thing that I tried recently that I had never tried before, and that was writing a book that was non-academic. And that was really interesting because the style of writing and the editorial work, it's a very different skill set to do, have creative license into something that is I'm creative in my research and my methodology, but it's highly systematic and empirical. And this was something entirely different.
Yeah. Which is interesting, again, in the context of who listens to this podcast, there's a lot of students, a lot of trainee sports psychologists. That idea of communicating in a slightly different way to what we're used to is actually a really important skill that, we can develop and we can work on, and we just get better at it by doing it.
And who's going to teach us to do it, right? Because a lot of the people who are in the higher learning institutions won't do that kind of thing. And so you're going to have to learn like I did on your own.
Yeah.
But it's also the vast majority of people are going to be more likely to write something for the lay population.
Yeah, hopefully.
Scientific population, right? Like the chances that you have to write a blog post for somebody much higher than having to write a research paper, right? Not all of us are researchers. Not all of us stay in academia. The vast majority of us don't. And I think it's a real disservice, to our students to only focus on, especially at the graduate level, to only focus on academic writing.
Maybe that's something that we can leave our listeners with at the end of this section, the end of this segment. Go and try and do something that you've never done before. See what happens. You never know. You might catch a glimpse of one of your natural gifts.
Way to wrap that up with a bow, Pete.
See, I told you I was good communicator.
Nice work.
All right, Rob, thank you. Rob's microphone's doing my head in. Rob, thank you so much. I feel like I've gotten to know you a little bit better, so thanks for playing our game.
I think it's been a wonderful experience. I wouldn't have expected the game at the end, but that's really cool.
So this is the 80% Mental podcast. I'm here with Professor Rob Schinke and, of course, Dr. Leah Washington. Rob, I just have a couple more questions for you, if that's all right. Just before just before the break there, we were talking a little bit about balance, a little bit about maybe work-life balance and having other things, I guess other parts of your identity, I suppose, other than being an athlete, right? And towards the end of your book, you talk about this notion of symmetry. And I was really interested in that because in some of the work that I've been doing with Marketa Simova on coach well-being, coaches don't really like the notion of work-life balance, right? Because it doesn't really exist. Instead, they talk about this integration between work values and personal values and relationship values. So it's not a balance, it's more of a kind of integration, intertwining of those different things. So I was really interested in this idea of symmetry. And I guess I just wondered if you could talk to us a little bit about that and how it maybe differs from this idea of work-life balance that people are maybe more familiar with.
Yeah, and I think the concept of symmetry or being symmetrical in one's life, I hate the word balance. It drives me crazy. I'm not a lover of balance. I don't think that we are ever in balance. If we're pursuing a passion, there's a clear imbalance. If you want to put a negative connotation on a gift pursuit, it's to say that no, you're unbalanced or you're having an imbalance in your life, and that you've got to rein it back in and have 50% of your time put towards something else. But I think the concept of symmetry is not unlike what you've just shared, Peter, in the sense that these varied interests have to be part of your life, and it may not be symmetry in a single day where you have all of these things that play in a single day, but over the course of a week and a month to actually reflect back on that month. If you're going to use a logbook or you're going to use some sort of reflection, you got to be aware of how you're spending your days and whether you are soloing into a single pursuit, or whether you are allowing yourself some opportunity to explore new things. Change is as good as rest, in my view, especially for people who are achievement driven. Is like I have one incredible world-class professional endurance athlete, and the person says they don't like rest. And that makes perfect sense, but the person does like a lot of activity and exploration and adventure and does that in their spare time. And that's what I mean by symmetry is, and I think it fits in well with that discussion that you probably had with Kenza Gunter, is this concept of being a soloist in a single thing and then switching over and being a soloist in something else, onboarding a new skill or something. It's not, you're replicating the same mistake over and over again in different stages of your life, unless you have multiple interests, some that you're curating, some that are well developed, some that are you're conceptualizing at different stages of their life. And that's what symmetry would be about. It's Peter the musician alongside Peter the podcaster, alongside Peter the scholar, alongside Peter the educator, alongside Peter the partner, alongside and having and making sure that those things are all curated and cared for, so that you are a healthy person, right?
And symmetry doesn't necessarily mean kind of having all of those things, giving all of those things equal attention at all times either, does it? There's a dynamism to that.
There is, and there has to be. It's impossible in a single day, especially if you're a perfectionist, like Leah, to say that you have to carve out this amount of time in a day for this and carve out this amount of time in a day for that. You have to have some fluidity to your structure and to go with the day's events and life circumstances and life's opportunities as much as life circumstances. But to actually curate all of those interests and to be to remain curious is part of the vibrancy of being a human being in a thriving human condition.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that, perfectionism often gets in the way of, right? Because like you want to be good at something like immediately, right? Or you're failing at something, and at least that's my personal experience. But also, and the idea of like allowing that time to develop and allowing that time for making mistakes and making errors. And one of the things that I've really started to do recently is just sort of change how I conceive of mistakes. We always talk about like, oh, mistakes are proof that you're trying or whatever. And I'm like, no, mistakes are continual proof that I'm failing. But that's like my own like fucked up self-talk but I've been starting to try to think of them as like a blooper reel of like, no mistakes. Like this is just going to be the blooper reel that you publish afterwards, like, or that you post afterwards of like, that it can be, and those are the times that those are the times we actually like laugh about later. It's like, oh, do you remember that time you did that stupid thing? And like, and trying to remind myself of like, and finding that, like you said, kind of symmetry in the process of the thing and not just like the end result of the thing. And I think that has kind of helped me think about like, well, what if I really wanted to do a new thing and to try something new, then I'm going to have a pretty decent blooper reel for that thing.
But a mistake is not necessarily it's a good thing. Mistakes are a good thing because you can actually discover through a misstep another pathway. So it's not necessarily casting something as a mistake. No one has a linear route. We all lead the circuitous route in a lifetime, and it's sort of a little bit meandering. As much as we like to suggest or frame or narrate it as this linear route to excellence, that is a total BS. And mistakes.
Yeah, well, try telling my brain that because it doesn't always work.
But some of the most interesting lessons I've learned in science and practice and in my own personal life have been by meandering or stepping off of the prescribed pathway and making some sort of mistake that actually turned out to be quite interesting.
There's a really interesting, I forget who it was or who I was talking to, and they were talking about like just how scientific discovery happens generally. And it's not always that like, I have this hypothesis and I'm going to test it. It's like we do a thing and then somebody goes, well, that's weird.
Yeah.
What's that about?
Rob, this has been a really, really interesting discussion, and I've thoroughly enjoyed it. I have one final question before we finish. What I'm trying to do with this series of the podcast is make it accessible to people who are kind of outside of sport. So we're kind of veering away from the sport and performance angle a little bit, and more into how normal human beings, as if athletes aren't normal human beings, can use some of the stuff that we talk about in sport and exercise psychology and kind of apply it to their own lives. So thinking about that and thinking about the conversation that we've had today about well-being, about gifts, about how to find our gifts and kind of utilize them, what would be your kind of big takeaway from this conversation? What would be the lesson or the piece of advice or even maybe like a task or an exercise for people to try from the book? What would that be?
Yeah, and I think that the one takeaway and the one deeply held value that I have in relation to my life and the lives of the people I mentor as graduate students or as athletes or as even my own children is you have to be willing to pursue something regardless of what someone else or what an environment might think of it. Sometimes the out of the ordinary life is built on a curiosity and a pursuit and the disrobing from inhibition and worry about what others might think about your interests, your curiosities, and how you would like to invest your life energy as part of a pathway to a meaningful existence. And I think we really have to stand tall and stick to what are our passions and stay with those and go with those and double down on them regardless of other people. Because if people are not leading their authentic lives and pursuing their own gifts and things that give them meaning, they're not going to give you props for yours.
Rob, I think that's a wonderful place to finish things up. So really, I just want to say thank you so much for coming on the podcast. It's been like I say, a wonderful conversation, and really appreciate you coming on.
You're so welcome.
What we'll do is we will put some of your details in the episode description, and we'll put a link to the book in the episode description as well. So if people want to check that out, and like I say, I don't normally do this on the podcast, but I would absolutely recommend this book. Go and check it out. We'll put all that in the episode description, so you can go and take a look. If you want to leave us a comment or a question, you can do so on the website 80percentmental.com. You can get in touch with us on Twitter at EPM Podcast or on Instagram at 80percentmental. We'd love to know what you thought about the conversation. Leah, thank you as well.
Anytime.
Pleasure as always.
Pleasure's mine.
And I hope that you out there in listener land enjoyed the conversation as much as I have. And that's it. We will see you next time.
No,
we won't see you because it's a podcast.